Happy Sabbath, everyone. And happy Sabbath to everyone else around the world that has open Sabbath. Sorry. So, I'm just going to give a very brief recap over what we discussed earlier, as because of time constraints, I had to rush towards the end. But I won't spend too much time going over that again. There were two main points that I wanted us to see. When the image of the beast is created, and distinguishing that at a waymark level from when it speaks. And so that's the picture work that we have on the board now. The image of the beast is set up and it's created, stands at the Sunday law. But it gives its loud cry to worship itself at the formalization of the message, which we mark as the loud cry. The second thing is that the image of the beast is a counterfeit message. Another symbol that we use for the image of the beast is the false prophet. So if we juxtapose the true prophet and the false prophet, we can track the message being unsealed at the Sunday law, from these two entities, the third angel and the image of the beast. One asking you to worship God, and the other asking you to worship the beast, up until you're tested at the loud cry. So often we mark two streams at the formalization of the message. Another aspect that I wanted to come to grips with at this formalization of the message is that the work of the stones externally, Michael Moore, AOC, and all that symbology represents, their work is finished for the Nethinims. If they want to be saved, they have to listen to the third angel, us. And that's in contrast to the message that's coming from the image of the beast. The gospel and the mystery of iniquity. Two messages that are now going to run parallel to decide who gets to have the Nethinims. The third aspect that I wanted to draw out from understanding the work of the image of the beast is how it's created. And when we went to, or when I referenced a sermon by A.T. Jones, he makes the point that it's how the essence of the United States is interpreted is what forms the character of the image of the beast. It's ideology. So we can see that image standing at the Sunday law. Once that ideology is cemented. And it's this tension between how interpretation is going to be done. The fourth and final aspect that I wanted to draw from that, in the context of how the image of the beast is created, was considering the time period between Panium and the Sunday law. So I've redrawn those lines reflecting the 144,000 priests and Levites as fractals. Just so that we mentally have a picture of exactly what I'm referring to. So in this time period, between Panium and the Sunday law, we have an increase of knowledge and a formalization. This is the harvest of the Levites. And we know from Jacob's time of trouble on the line of the 144,000 that we can mark a death decree at Concord. So it was my suggestion that how the judicial branch interprets law or precedent in June 24, 2022 establishes a death decree for women. So I hope that's a bit clearer in what I was doing towards the end of that study. So we'll move on to the next topic. And what we aim to address in this presentation is who creates the image of the beast. So, alongside the rise of the image of the beast is the dragon, the seventh kingdom of Bible prophecy. Their stories run parallel, and one of the components that we identify as happening at the Sunday law is the death of democracy. In other words, the breaking of those horns of the lamb-like beast. So I want to take a bit of time considering how democracies die in modern society. Who plays a role in that death? So when we think of Alpha and Omega, we know that that's a piece of methodology where the beginning can give us information about the end. But we recognize that as much as we can overlay lines on top of each other, where we put the alpha on top and the omega at the bottom, there's still a line of progression that's happening. So what you see at the end is not going to perfectly reflect what you see at the beginning. Because of this principle of progression. So I want to take us to when democracies were being founded across Europe and the United States, where humanity was coming out of a period of monarchies. Today, we have a system of government where in established democracies, there are stronger institutions with presidents or prime ministers. So the death of democracy won't look exactly like its birth. As a contrast. But at a principle level, I'm hoping that's what we can draw out when we do look at that history. So, what we're going to go through, I found really fascinating when we consider democracies. And the role that conservative parties in particular played in the process of bringing democracy to the world. Often we think of democracy as developing because of social movements, the rise of the middle class, economic changes. But there's another crucial factor that has helped shape and establish democracies throughout modern history. And that's conservative political parties. So if we think what makes democracies stable, we know that they're not inevitable. History shows us that political systems can and do break down. Which often leads to authoritarians or undemocratic regimes. So throughout the 19th and 20th century, a wave of democratization swept through Europe. Some of them ended up stable democracies. Some developed strong, robust systems. And some broke down and reversed. At the time, conservatives were faced with a dilemma. Who were the conservatives at that point in time? Thinking at the core definition of what a conservative is. It was your monarchs, your elites, your aristocrats, your landowners. And they had so much to lose because of democracies. And so when people are shouting, let's have voting, let's democratize, a lot of them resisted. And in a lot of the cases, they were the primary defenders of established hierarchies and social orders. However, in other circumstances, in countries like the United Kingdom, these same conservative parties, over time, became essential in ensuring that democracy survived. As some of them recognized that the best way to hold on to power was to reluctantly accept these new norms. So when we look at history, we can show, and I hope demonstrate, that often conservative parties have acted as gatekeepers of democracy. And often they were reluctant defenders of those democratic institutions, as they wanted to protect their own interests. So there's two roads that a country can go down. A settled democratization, or unsettled. In your settled democratization, countries like Britain experience this more gradual, stable transition towards democracy. As the conservative parties in Britain were able to absorb the rising tide of demands and participate in the process of democratizing Britain, which helped to create this more enduring democratic system. On the other hand, you had countries like Germany, where democratization took an unsettled path, where often there were lots of setbacks and ultimately a failure of the Conservative Party. These parties were weak, fragmented, and so they didn't act as a stabilizing force, which ultimately gave reason to the collapse of democracy in Germany. So we're going to go through a bit of history, and keeping in mind this question: how do conservative parties act as gatekeepers of democracy? So first we're going to go through how it should work, in the case of Britain, and then after that we'll contrast it with what happened in Germany under the Weimar Republic. conceptually, when we think of these stabilizing and destabilizing forces, it's my hope that we can see through this thread how these conservative parties acted as stabilizing forces. So, in considering Britain, the 19th and 20th century were a time when they were becoming democratized. And your Tories, or your Conservatives, and your Conservative Party played a really pivotal role in shaping what democracy was going to look like in Great Britain. And a big reason for this is because they organized well, they strategically adapted to the calls for reform, by mobilizing voters and reaching through different approaches of how to participate in mass politics. The three critical strategies that they used is they formed what was called the Primrose League. League? Primrose. It's just the word primrose. Yeah. They mobilized voters and they adapted to the demands of the day. And so each of these factors highlighted how conservative elites in Britain, at least, ended up creating this stable, cohesive political force that promoted democratic stability. So this Primrose League was, in the context of the Conservative Party, one of their most significant organizational innovations that started in 1883, sorry. This tool that they used became vital for mobilizing support across different social classes. They blended politics with social events, and so initially it intended on being this exclusive, fraternal society. But over time, it opens its doors to men, women, and people from lower social classes. So, as I said, it's founded in 1833. Because the conservative leaders needed a way to engage with voters. And this is how they decided they were going to fill this gap. This Primrose League was organized into local branches across the country. It was a society that had ritual symbols to try and foster loyalty. And at the time, it was strange because they included women in this process. And by doing that, they gained a large base of women supporters. So this is established, and now they're going to go out into the field to try and get voters. What today we would call as grassroots mobilization. By having picnics, social football games, and met people where they were. And this saw a quantifiable impact on elections, as people were willing to vote for these same people who not long ago held the power in society undemocratically. I'm going to read a quote, but you don't have it. It says, "The Conservative Party's leaders understood that for the party to thrive in an era of expanding suffrage, they needed to adapt to the realities of mass politics. Unlike a lot of the other countries in Europe, who just resisted suffrage from day one." So, just recapping this timeline before we go into what happened in Germany. In 1883, you have the Primrose League formed. In 1884 up until 1887, it expanded to include women and other marginalized groups. Which was new for a country at that time. Remembering that this is a conservative party. In 1888, they established what were called wardens to oversee voter registration, canvassing, which ultimately strengthened their work at a grassroots level. And so once you get to the 1900s, the Conservative Party had established itself as embedded in society, as a strong party. reading quote 1 in your references and quotes. I'll read it in full. It says, the British Conservative Party's survival in an era of mass democracy was not a passive occurrence, but the result of deliberate strategic choices to engage a broader constituency. Sorry, my translator is just looking for the quote. So, what this is telling us is that the Conservative Party was willing to integrate into these new social forces. And this was important because it reduced the appeal of radicalism, where democracy could thrive, and fostered a environment where democracy could thrive. And it effectively transformed itself from holding on to power to finding a different means to hold on to power. We'll quickly explore what happened to Germany under the Weimar Republic. Which existed from 1919 to 1933. And gives us a warning of what happens when your conservative parties are internally weak and don't provide stability and are fragmented, and they cannot contain or moderate radicals. The Conservative Party at the time was called, and I'm going to try and say this, and I know it's wrong, Deutsche National Volkspartei. In short, the DNVP. We can remember the DNVP. But it was this party that caused so much havoc in its destabilization of the Weimar Republic. It was established in 1918 when the German Empire had collapsed. At the end of World War I. And so there's this shift to the Weimar Republic as democracy is being championed across Europe. But immediately it faced challenges. The DNVP inherited the loyalty of your old aristocracy, your military, who just were strongly opposed to democracy, fundamentally. where unlike your British Conservative Party, which embraced democracy to protect their own interests, the DNVP was just deeply divided from the beginning. So there's this internal weakness organizationally where it wavers between fundamental nationalism and being pragmatic, where there's various disputes that are happening internal to the party, which led to just this chronic instability. Some factions sought to moderate the radicals, while other factions just had no interest in moderating them. Bought into the conspiracies of the day, and inevitably destabilizes the whole regime. From 1924 up until 1928, there's a brief period in which the DNVP is going through its golden age. Germany enjoyed relative stability. They demonstrated that they were willing to work with other parties. However, this period was short-lived. Because it was so fragile as a party, the party's moderates struggled to keep out the extremists. And then you get to 1928 to 1930, where things begin to unravel. Because now they're going to shift their allegiance to a man named Alfred Hugenberg, who was a radical nationalist. And he steers the party far right. Under his leadership, all moderate voices were pushed out. As he sought to purify the party. Reading the second quote, it says, Hugenberg's tenure created a platform for extremism that not only splintered the DNVP, but also made the party an active force against democracy itself. And so the party started to fragment. as moderates started to leave, if they weren't already kicked out. As a result, any organizational cohesion that existed collapsed and the party became polarized. This radicalization of the DNVP coincided with a broader decline in general in the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic. Its government. And so, as Hugenberg's leadership takes the party in a specific direction, he's now going to form alliances with extremists. At that time, it was with the Nazi Party. And this partnership between your traditional conservatives the DNVP and your radical nationalists, your Nazis, proved to be this vital blow that kicked the Weimar Republic off the edge. This morning, Elder Parminder discussed the concerns of the people are the economy. Time and time again in history, economic cries have been the most fertile ground for populists to rise up. Whether it's the Great Depression in the 1930s, or it's the Great Recession after 2008. The economy is the top concern of people, and populists know which buttons to press. So in 1929, the Great Depression occurs. Germany is politically unstable. That radicalization of the DNVP intensified. And populism and political extremism just became more ingrained in the psyche of the people. As Hugenberg capitalized on this crisis. The DNVP's radicalization weakened the traditional conservative bloc to the point where it could no longer keep out extremists. And so by 1931, when the DNVP officially forms this alliance with Hitler's Nationalist Socialist Germany's Workers' Party, the NSDAP. So in 1931, the DNVP enters into this alliance with Hitler's party. And it's their belief that it could control and use the Nazis to further its own agenda is what came back and bit itself. And this miscalculation proved chaotic. I'm going to read quote number 3. The author says, "The disintegration of Germany's Conservative Party signaled the death knell of the Weimar Republic, as democracy was left defenseless against the rising tide of extremism." So in these two histories, we have two situations where conservative parties either decided to maintain their power by playing along, or they thought they could maintain power by working with extremists. And this phenomena can be demonstrated throughout Europe, whether it's Sweden, Denmark, or Belgium, which had strong conservative parties, or Spain, Italy, and as we saw, Germany, who had weak conservative parties. And in each of those countries, authoritarians rose up. So there's two ways in which these conservative parties can contribute to democracy's stability. The first is by blocking radical factions and the second was by institutionalizing the electoral success. Working with the institutions. Remember, this is how democracies were born. Not necessarily how they die. So I want to go to today and look at the Republican Party in America specifically. In discussing democracy's death, that we expect at the Sunday law. When we think of the big authoritarians of the past, one of those big names is Mussolini. And often, history has been painted as a way where he marched into Rome, had this great insurrection, and stole power. But the reality is is that he used the systems of the day to legally get into power. Whether it's Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, or Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Each of these dictators or authoritarians were legitimized by their respective parties instead of being kept out. And the result is the story we see in history. So the key to strong political gatekeeping is isolating and rejecting your radicals, or, when necessary, making alliances with those you don't agree with, as we've seen time and time again in France, where parties who aren't in sync agreed to come into concord to keep out radicals like Le Pen. I'll read quote 7. In fact, I'll summarize it. We won't read it. But in essence, it's pointing out that often the rise of authoritarians doesn't happen because of illegal means. Often the keys are just handed to them. I'll read quote number 8. And I'll cut it up into small bits. The Weimar political system had been founded in 1919 by a pro-democratic coalition, but beginning in 1930, with the German economy reeling, the center-right fell prey to infighting and the communists and Nazis grew in popularity. And so now when we consider what gatekeeping looks like today, America has seen its own story of the crucial role political parties in gatekeeping, where they acted as filters for unfit people from gaining political power. When America was founded, Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers, "History will teach us that of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the great number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people. I'll paraphrase that, by trying to pull on the heartstrings of the people. Which led to tyrants rising up. Tyrants. So, in Alexander Hamilton's mind, he had to think of a way to keep these radicals out. A screening device of some sort. We have different views of the Electoral College. How it's not really democratic, or that it doesn't reflect the will of the people. But originally, one of the core elements of the Electoral College was to have this indirect election system that reflected Hamilton's thinking, to keep out radicals. He had a very suspicious view of people, knowing that people are emotional, often buy into the ideas of populists, in his mind, he thought, I'm not going to leave it to chance for a tyrant or a demagogue to rise up. So the Electoral College, at the time, was a group of men who were politicians, who knew how politics worked, who could decide if this person should really be president. Over time, of course, political parties rose up because of James Madison, Jefferson, and they took on this role of gatekeeping. Eventually evolving into what we have today. For a long time, before you had your primaries, your caucuses, i.e., like what we saw in July, weren't voted by the people. It was decided by a group of men in a room as they discussed the merits of the different candidates. Over time, people began to recognize that this wasn't really democratic, because the people didn't have a say. So, they had to reform. And over time, across different states, voters in those states started voting for who they thought should represent the party. So the political parties couldn't act as gatekeepers anymore, formally. But as it is today, there's what's called an invisible primary, where before a candidate even gets to the primary, your party elites decide who they're going to back. And so often, you'll get people like Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, at the time Paul Ryan, endorse a candidate. And that adds a ton of weight as to how well a candidate is going to do in the primaries across the country. In 2016, and more so in 2024, Republicans had a choice. Are they going to keep this extremist out? Or are they going to form an alliance with the Nazi party? I say that symbolically. And you have your never Trumpers who tried to resist, but it didn't take hold. And instead, by the time you get to July 2024, the Republican Party ideologically has been completely transformed. And they don't play the role that they were supposed to in gatekeeping and ensuring that Trump doesn't get on that ticket. When we discussed conservative parties at democracy's founding, what were they conserving? Emma.
I think they were trying to conserve the status quo
Of what?
of how the country was run.
So Emma said they tried to preserve the status quo, and the status quo was that it was a monarchy. So they tried to reserve the established hierarchies. And so today, when we're discussing the death of democracy, and we think of the role that the conservatives should have played, what are they conserving, Barbara? Anyone else? Raquel says the same. Except this time it's not monarchies. Today it's a patriarchal, hierarchical status quo. It's two and the same, really. Patriarchy at the beginning and patriarchy at the end. So when Elder Parminder says that a woman could never win the 2024 election, because what we're discussing is democracy's death, then we know that conservatives are going to conserve the status quo as they mobilize voters to establish that order. So as we wrap up and we think of the image of the beast, when it is made, how it is made, it's my suggestion is that who makes it is the Republican Party, because of the role that the Conservative Party was supposed to do. And so, who are those that cry for a Sunday law at that point? Who asks for it? Is it everyone? Who is it? It's your staunch Conservative Party members. By the time you get to November, it's an election that's opened up to everyone. So the mere fact that you have undecided voters who do vote Republican shows you that they aren't creating the image of the beast. It's the ones that have fully bought into the ideology. When you get to the primaries, however, who votes in primaries? It's your registered party members who believe in what that message is. Each political party in a democracy has a responsibility. And it's my suggestion that, to use a colloquial term, one of those parties sold their soul to the devil in July this year, in a fateful alliance, by fully backing that extremist. So, in bringing together the two presentations done today, in answering when the image of the beast is formed, how it is formed, and who plays the biggest part in its forming, I hope that the steps that I've taken lead us to one conclusion: why that RNC was so important, why that marked the image of the beast being created, and in turn, why I think that is the Sunday Law waymark. Perhaps we have different expectations of what that waymark looks like, what we expect the image to be doing, and when it does what we expect it to be doing. It's been suggested, or should I say said, by Alder Parminder that the executive branch is necessary for the Sunday law. But which part in that dispensation? Is it necessary for the image of the beast to be created? Or is it necessary for the time in which it speaks? Again, the suggestion being made is that that ideology, the mystery of iniquity, found its vessel in the Republican Party that has now embodied the essence of the beast. All it needs now is life, which the executive branch gives it. And that branch then goes on to speak like a dragon after the fact. I'm not suggesting that the image of the beast has started speaking, but the image has been set up and is standing in the plains of Dura, and Nebuchadnezzar is about to call everyone to come and see it. There's one final quote that I'd like to read. If you'd give me the opportunity to look for it. It's quote number 6 in the notes. And I'll read it in its entirety. If we step back from the last hours, we see that there is a second reason why Hugenberg and the DNVP mattered to these last moments of the regime's demise. In particular, that the political found itself in this crisis in the first place, with generals and former generals behind closed doors possessing the means and opportunity to negotiate the regime out of existence, was due to a gaping absence, the absence of a moderate right. The resulting dynamic, brought on by the radicalization of the DNVP in 1928, made the political system vulnerable even before economic crisis had arrived. As the political scientist Stanley Hoffman once observed, paraphrasing Montesquieu, when states seem to collapse from one blow, there are deep reasons why that single blow was sufficient. And it's this last sentence that I think is the key to this. In what would turn out to be the most destructive instance of democratic collapse in the 20th century, the fate of democracy in Germany was in the hands of conservatives, and the fundamental impetus driving events in January at the time was not their strength, but rather their weakness. So once the moderates just waiting for other translators. So once the moderates in the Republican Party were cleaned out, the fate of democracy in the USA was in the hands of the conservatives, the Republicans. And it was their weakness as a party that brought about the Sunday Law. The reason why I've gone through this is because of a question that's been burning in my mind. Why does a vote that happens in one party matter so much amongst a small proportion of the electorate? It's because all along, them behaving themselves is what kept democracy alive. So when they don't behave, as history showed us, democracy dies. My final point is that if we recall, when we expect a test, when we expect to be making decisions between two streams, it's at Exeter, not at Boston, where it has been publicly suggested the Sunday Law is. In July 2024. And once you get to that testing point, the two streams is no longer conservatives and liberals. It's the image of the beast and you and us, the movement, as the third angel. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, as we try to consider where we are in this earth's history, I pray that you may help us grapple with the responsibilities placed on every faction in society. I pray that you may continually help us understand what is and what isn't truth as we march towards your second advent. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.